They stood together in the warm light of the cabin, two broken beings who had somehow found wholeness in each other's company. Outside, the eternal winter of Epsilon 7 continued its assault on their small sanctuary. But inside, something precious had taken root and flourished against all odds. Later that night, as Niara slept peacefully on her cot, Ethan sat by the window, watching the luminescent flower pulse gently in the darkness. The events of the day, Torres's perceptive generosity, the conversation with Niara, had awakened feelings he had long thought dormant: hope, possibility, connection, emotions he had deliberately excised from his life after the mining disaster. The cabin creaked softly as a gust of wind swept down from the mountains. Once, that sound had reinforced his isolation, reminding him of the hostile environment that separated him from the rest of humanity. Now, it felt almost protective, the sound of shelter, of home. Home. The concept had been absent from his thoughts for years. The cabin had been merely a place to exist, a self-imposed prison for his guilt. When had it transformed into something more? Perhaps when Niara had first spoken her name, claiming her identity in this space. Perhaps during the long nights of conversation, or the shared labor of repairs, or the simple moments of companionable silence. Or perhaps it had always held the potential for home, waiting only for him to allow connection back into his life. Morning arrived with a rare break in the clouds, allowing actual sunlight to penetrate Epsilon 7's atmosphere for the first time in weeks. The sudden brightness woke Ethan from a deep sleep, the most restful he had experienced in longer than he could remember. He found Niara already awake, standing by the window, her face lifted to the light. The sun transformed her, illuminating the subtle iridescence of her skin, highlighting the delicate ridges along her spine where her borrowed shirt had slipped aside, casting her entire being in a glow that seemed almost ethereal. "Sun feels different here," she said without turning. "Thinner, still beautiful." Ethan moved to stand beside her, drawn to her quiet joy in this simple pleasure. "It doesn't come often," he warned. "Maybe once every few weeks in this season." "Then we enjoy now," she replied pragmatically, turning to smile at him. The sunlight caught her eyes, making the violet depths shimmer with flecks of silver. Special day. They took advantage of the rare good weather to work outside. The exterior of the cabin needed maintenance after the winter storms, and several of the defensive systems required recalibration. They worked efficiently together, anticipating each other's needs, communicating with the shorthand of those who have learned each other's rhythms. Their plant, Niara had begun calling it Hope Flower in her language, had fully opened its first bloom overnight. In the direct sunlight, the luminescent edges of its petals seemed to absorb the light, storing it somehow. 3 more buds had appeared, promising additional blossoms in the days to come. As they worked, Niara began to sing softly in her native language, a melodic, flowing sound unlike anything in human music. The song rose and fell like water, sometimes soaring to notes that seemed impossibly high, sometimes dropping to resonant tones that vibrated in the chest rather than the ear. "It's beautiful," Ethan said when she paused. "What does it mean?" Niara considered for a moment, likely struggling with translation. "Song of new growth," she finally said. "When plant breaks from soil, defies stone, reaches for light, we sing to honor persistence, determination." "Appropriate," Ethan observed, glancing at their flourishing plant. "Not just for plant," Niara replied, her gaze steady on his face. "For us too, breaking through hard places, growing despite difficult ground." The simple observation struck Ethan deeply. They were indeed like plants that had found a way to thrive in inhospitable soil, damaged but resilient, drawing strength from unlikely sources, persisting when logic suggested they should falter. They continued working through the day, taking full advantage of the sunlight and milder temperatures. By evening, the cabin's exterior was fully repaired, the defensive systems upgraded, and their living space more secure than it had been since Nyara's arrival during the winter storm. As twilight descended, bringing with it a return of the typical Epsilon chill, they retired to the cabin's warmth. The day's physical labor had left them pleasantly tired, content in the satisfaction of work well done. They prepared a meal together from their new supplies, experimenting with combinations of flavors that made their standard rations more appealing. After eating, Nyara explored the educational materials Torres had sent, marveling at the formalized instruction for Federation standard. "We'll learn properly now," she said enthusiastically. "Speak better. Maybe learn writing too." "You're already doing remarkably well," Ethan assured her. "But yes, these will help." He hesitated, then added, "I could teach you, if you'd like. I'm not a professional instructor, but I know the language." Her face brightened. "Yes, prefer learning from you. More." She searched for the word. Meaningful. The simple statement warmed something in Ethan's chest. There was power in being needed, in having knowledge or skills that could benefit another. For too long, he had viewed his abilities only through the lens of past failure, the expertise that hadn't been enough to save 43 lives. Nyara's eager acceptance of his offer reminded him that his knowledge still held value, still had the capacity to improve rather than harm. They began immediately, using the instruction materials as a guide, but adapting the lessons to Nyara's specific needs and learning style. Her intelligence was evident in how quickly she grasped concepts, making connections between words and forming increasingly complex sentences. Her pronunciation remained distinctively musical, a Larian accent that transformed Federation standard into something almost poetic. As the evening progressed, their lesson evolved into a broader cultural exchange. Nyara shared Larian concepts that had no direct translation in human languages. Ideas about communal consciousness, cyclical time, and the interconnectedness of living beings. In turn, Ethan explained human idioms, historical references, and social customs that appeared in the language materials. "Humans very strange," Nyara observed with gentle humor, after a particularly convoluted explanation of Earth regional expressions. "Make simple things complicated." Ethan laughed, a full, genuine sound that surprised them both. "I can't argue with that," he admitted. "We do have a talent for complexity." Nyara tilted her head, studying him with curious eyes. "Your laugh is nice," she said simply. "Should do more." The directness of the observation caught Ethan off guard, bringing heat to his face. "I'm out of practice," he said. "There hasn't been much to laugh about here." "Until now?" she asked, her tone making it a genuine question, rather than a presumption. Ethan considered this. "Yes," he said finally. "Until now." Their eyes held for a moment longer than usual, an unspoken current passing between them. Nyara was the first to look away, returning her attention to the language materials with a slight color rising to her cheeks, another trait her species shared with humans. Apparently. The moment passed. But something had shifted, a boundary crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. They continued their lesson with a new awareness of each other, a heightened consciousness of proximity, of casual touches, of shared glances. Later, as they prepared for sleep, Nyara paused by the shelf where the repaired wooden star sat, alongside her salvaged Larian treasures. She touched the star gently, then turned to Ethan with an expression of quiet determination. "Tomorrow," she said, "want to place star on my pillow. If you agree." Ethan frowned slightly, not understanding the significance. "Of course, but why?" "In my culture," she explained carefully, "when find home after being lost, place symbol of protection near where you rest, Show gratitude for safe harbor. Most use family token, but, she gestured to the star. This important to you, important to cabin, would honor both. The request touched Ethan deeply. The star had been a painful reminder for so long, a symbol of failure and loss. Niara was offering to transform it, to give it new meaning as a token of sanctuary and gratitude. Yes, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I'd be honored. Niara smiled, relieved by his acceptance. Good, is right. She reached out and briefly squeezed his hand before moving to her cot. Rest well, Ethan. You too, he replied softly. That night, as Ethan drifted toward sleep, he found his thoughts unusually peaceful. The guilt and regret that had been his constant companions for years seemed less overwhelming, less defining. They weren't gone. Perhaps they never would be completely. But they had receded, making space for other emotions to exist alongside them. Hope, connection, possibility. Outside, Epsilon 7's endless winter continued. Inside, warmth persisted in more ways than one. The next morning brought a return to typical Epsilon weather. Heavy cloud cover, bitter wind, the perpetual twilight that passed for daylight on the planet. But the shift in atmosphere within the cabin remained, a subtle but profound change in how they moved through their shared space. True to her word, Niara carefully placed the wooden star on her pillow after making her cot. The simple gesture seemed to please her deeply, as if she had fulfilled an important ritual. Throughout the day, Ethan noticed her glancing at it occasionally, a small smile touching her lips each time. They settled into a new routine over the following weeks. Mornings were devoted to maintenance and survival tasks, checking systems, preparing food, monitoring weather conditions. Afternoons usually involved some form of construction or improvement to the cabin, utilizing materials from their expanded supplies. Evenings were for learning, language lessons that expanded to include reading and writing, cultural exchange that grew more nuanced as Niara's vocabulary improved, and shared exploration of the educational content Torres had provided. Their plant continued its improbable flourishing, producing more luminescent blooms that glowed softly through the perpetual twilight. Niara tended it with devoted care, singing to it in her language, touching its leaves with gentle fingers. Under her attention, it grew stronger and more vibrant, defying the hostile environment with stubborn persistence. One evening, as they sat reviewing a particularly challenging language lesson, Ethan noticed Niara repeatedly touching a specific point at the base of her neck, the location of the largest trafficking brand. She had been unusually quiet all day, her usual enthusiasm for learning subdued. "Does it hurt?" he asked gently, indicating the spot she kept touching. She looked up, startled by the question, then shook her head. "Not physical pain," she said. "Memory pain. Today is anniversary. 1 year since capture." Her voice faltered slightly. "Thinking of family. Wondering if they search still, if they live still." Ethan moved to sit beside her, close, but not touching, offering presence without intrusion. "I'm sorry," he said, knowing the inadequacy of the words, but having nothing better to offer. Niara nodded acceptance of his sympathy, then surprised him by leaning against his side, seeking comfort through proximity. "Hard day," she murmured. "Memories strong." Without thinking, Ethan put his arm around her shoulders, drawing her closer. She fit against him naturally, her smaller frame nestling into the space as if designed to be there. They sat in silence for several minutes, the simple contact saying more than words could convey. "Could we search?" Ethan asked eventually. "The communications unit Torres sent. It can't transmit, but it can receive. We might find information about your people, maybe even about your specific settlement." Niara tensed slightly against him, then relaxed again. "Thought of this," she admitted. Afraid to know. If all gone? If none survived? She trailed off, the possibility too painful to articulate. And if some did survive, Ethan countered gently. If they're still searching for you, still hoping? She was quiet for a long moment, considering. You right, she said finally. Need to know. Good or bad. Truth better than uncertainty. She looked up at him, her violet eyes reflecting the firelight. Will you help me search? Of course, he promised. First thing tomorrow. She nodded, seemingly satisfied with this plan, but made no move to leave his side. Instead, she settled more comfortably against him, her head resting on his shoulder. Thank you, she said softly. For understanding. For not saying forget past, only look forward. Some wounds need acknowledgement before healing. Ethan thought of the wooden star, of the 43 lives lost in the mining collapse, of his own long journey through grief and guilt. Yes, he agreed. They do. They remained that way until the fire burned low, taking comfort in each other's presence, united by the shared experience of loss, despite the vast differences in their backgrounds. When they finally separated to prepare for sleep, something had solidified between them, a deeper understanding, a stronger bond. The next day, they activated the communications unit and began their search for information about Nyara's people. The process was slow and often frustrating. The unit's capabilities were limited, designed primarily for educational content rather than comprehensive data retrieval. Additionally, news from the frontier regions was sporadic and often outdated by the time it reached the Federation information networks. Nevertheless, they persisted, sifting through whatever information they could access about Larian settlements, trafficking incidents, and refugee movements following raids. Nyara's settlement had been small and relatively isolated, barely a footnote in official records, making specific information about its fate particularly difficult to find. After several days of searching, they finally found a brief mention in a Federation humanitarian report. Survivors from the Larian settlement on Tau Ceti IV have been relocated to the refugee center on Proxima Station. Approximately 30 individuals recovered from various locations following the Vermilion chain raids. Reunification efforts ongoing. Nyara stared at the screen, her hands trembling slightly. Some lived, she whispered. Some escaped. 30 survivors, Ethan confirmed, scanning the report for additional details. The settlement had how many residents originally? Nearly 100, Nyara replied, her voice tight with emotion. Still, 30 is more than I hoped. Family might be among them. The report was dated just 3 months earlier, relatively recent by frontier standards. The refugee center on Proxima Station was a well-established facility, known for its long-term support programs and family reunification services. If Nyara's relatives had survived, that would be the most likely place for them to be registered. We should try to send a message, Ethan said, already calculating possibilities. The supply drone. We could modify it to deliver a data package to the settlement, and from there, Administrator Torres might be willing to forward it to official channels. Nyara's eyes widened at the suggestion. Possible, not dangerous. Some risk, Ethan acknowledged honestly. Any communication creates potential for tracking, but we can use encryption, anonymous routing. Torres would understand the need for discretion. Nyara considered this, visibly weighing hope against caution. Worth risk, she decided finally. Need to try. For family. For self. They spent the next several days composing the message. It needed to be brief, yet contain enough specific information to identify Nyara to her people, without revealing too much to potential interceptors. They included details that only a true member of her settlement would know. The pattern of the community gathering hall, the words of a particular ceremony, the location of a sacred grove. When the message was complete, Nyara recorded a short audio segment in her native language, a personal identification that would be unmistakable to her family if they heard it. The sound of her voice, speaking her mother tongue, filled the cabin with melodic tones that seemed to resonate with the very walls, as if the structure itself recognized the significance of the moment. The waiting that followed was difficult. The supply drone wouldn't arrive for another month. And even after they sent their message, it could be weeks or months before any response might come, if one came at all. The uncertainty weighed on Nyara, manifesting in renewed nightmares and moments of distant melancholy. Ethan did what he could to support her through this period of waiting. He intensified their language lessons, introduced more complex maintenance projects, and spent long evenings simply talking about his past, about Earth, about the wider universe beyond their isolated cabin. Anything to keep her mind engaged, to prevent her from dwelling too deeply on possibilities beyond their control. Their plant continued to thrive, now nearly as tall as Ethan himself, and covered with luminescent blooms that glowed brightly even during Epsilon's darkest periods. Nyara had begun collecting the unusual sap that occasionally beaded on its stems, storing it in small containers salvaged from their supplies. When Ethan questioned this practice, she explained that in Larian tradition, the first exudations of a new growth were considered powerful, carriers of the plant's essential nature, useful for healing and protection. As the days passed, their physical proximity increased naturally, almost imperceptibly. What had begun as occasional comforting touches evolved into habitual closeness, sitting shoulder to shoulder during meals, working side by side on projects, even reading together from the same screen, heads bent close to share the view. Neither acknowledged this shift verbally, but both were acutely aware of it, of the growing current of unspoken feeling between them. The night before the supply drone was scheduled to arrive, a particularly violent storm descended on the cabin. Wind howled around the structure, finding every small gap in the insulation, creating an eerie chorus of moans and whistles. Ice particles struck the reinforced windows like tiny projectiles, a constant percussion accompanying the wind's melody. Unable to sleep through the cacophony, Ethan found Nyara already awake, standing by the window, watching the storm's fury. The wooden star sat in her palm, her fingers tracing its mended fractures absently. "Reminds me," she said without turning, "of night you found me. Storm like this. Thought I'd die there, in snow. Then light appeared." She glanced back at him. "Your light. Your door opening." Ethan moved to stand beside her, watching the swirling snow illuminated by the cabin's exterior lights. "I almost didn't go out," he admitted. "Almost convinced myself it was a trap, or just debris triggering the sensors." "What changed mind?" she asked, genuinely curious. He considered the question, wanting to give her an honest answer. "I'm not entirely sure," he said finally. "Instinct, maybe. Or perhaps I was just tired of turning away from life." He looked down at her, at this being who had transformed his existence so completely. "Whatever the reason, I'm grateful for it." Nyara turned fully toward him, her expression solemn in the dim light. "Tomorrow, message goes," she said. "Begin waiting. Begin possibility of change." She hesitated, then continued more softly. "Need to say something. Before that. Important." Ethan nodded encouragement, sensing the weight she placed on whatever she needed to express. "If family lives, if way exists to reach them," she began carefully, "would be joy beyond words. But," she took a deep breath, "not simple joy, because leaving here would be sorrow too." Her eyes held his steadily. "Understand?" The implication was clear. If a path to reunification with her people opened, Nyara would face an impossible choice: between reconnecting with her past and the new life she had built here. With him. "I understand," Ethan said gently. "Family is irreplaceable. If you have a chance to be with them again—" "Not what I'm saying," she interrupted, unusual intensity in her voice. "Not choosing between family and you. Saying both matter, both important." She placed her hand on his chest, over his heart. "Whatever comes, whatever choice must make. Want you know, this cabin, this life, you, all have become home too." Ethan covered her hand with his own, overwhelmed by her words. For so long, he had existed in isolation, convinced that meaningful connection was behind him, that his role in life was simply to endure as penance for past failures. Niara had shattered that conviction, bringing light to places long dark within him. "Whatever happens," he promised. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you. But selfishly." He paused, gathering courage for the admission. "Selfishly. I hope you stay. You've brought life back to this place. Back to me." In the dim light, her eyes shimmered with emotion. "Not selfish," she whispered. "Not when feeling is shared." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken meaning. Then, with the same courage she had shown since the day he found her in the snow, Niara rose on tiptoes and pressed her lips gently to his. The kiss was brief, almost tentative, but it carried the weight of everything that had grown between them. Trust built from fear, connection forged in isolation, hope kindled amid despair. When she drew back, her expression held a mixture of vulnerability and certainty that touched Ethan deeply. No words seemed adequate. Instead, he drew her into an embrace, holding her close as the storm raged outside. They remained that way for a long time, the physical contact expressing what language, Federation Standard, or Larian, could not fully convey. When they finally separated, a new understanding existed between them, a threshold crossed from which neither wished to retreat. They returned to their respective sleeping areas, but the invisible barrier that had maintained their separate spaces felt permeable now, a convention rather than a necessity. Morning arrived with unexpected clarity. The storm had passed during the night, leaving a landscape transformed by fresh snow and ice sculptures shaped by the wind. The sky had cleared to a pale lavender, as close to blue as Epsilon 7's atmosphere ever achieved, allowing weak sunlight to illuminate the scene. They prepared for the drone's arrival in companionable silence. The events of the night creating a sense of shared intimacy that required no discussion. Occasionally, their eyes would meet, and small smiles would pass between them, private acknowledgments of the shift in their relationship. The drone appeared right on schedule, descending to the landing pad with mechanical precision. As before, it carried the standard supplies along with a small package from Administrator Torres. This time, however, there was also an official-looking container bearing Federation insignia, something neither of them had expected. Ethan approached cautiously, examining the container before bringing it inside. It was sealed with diplomatic protocols, addressed simply to residents of Outpost E7291. Such formal designations suggested official channels had somehow identified their location despite their precautions. "Should we open it?" Niara asked, apprehension evident in her voice. After months of careful anonymity, direct contact from Federation authorities felt potentially threatening. Ethan examined the seals more closely. "These are humanitarian codes," he observed. "Medical or refugee services. Not enforcement or military." He looked up at Niara. "I think it's safe." With careful movements, he broke the seals and opened the container. Inside lay a data crystal and a physical letter printed on actual paper, a rarity in frontier communications. The letter was brief, but momentous. To the Larian refugee at Outpost E7291. This communication comes via secure humanitarian channels, following an anonymous inquiry forwarded from Settlement Alpha. The data crystal contains a message from individuals claiming to be your kin, currently residing at Proxima Station Refugee Center. Federation Refugee Services authorized this response due to the specific cultural identifiers included in your inquiry. No records of this exchange exist in standard channels. Response may be made through the same secure route if desired. Office of Refugee Reunification, Sector 7. Nyara's hands trembled as she took the data crystal, turning it over in her fingers as if unable to believe its reality. "So fast," she whispered. "Never thought. So fast." Ethan moved to the communications unit, preparing it to read the crystal's contents. "Torres must have expedited things," he said. "Used her connections to bypass normal protocols." The crystal contained a single audio file. When they played it, the cabin filled with the musical tones of the Larian language. An older female voice, speaking with obvious emotion, occasionally joined by a deeper male voice. Though Ethan couldn't understand the words, the meaning was unmistakable from the urgency and joy in the speaker's tones. Nyara listened with her eyes closed, tears streaming freely down her face. When the message ended, she remained silent for several moments, visibly processing what she had heard. "Family?" Ethan asked softly, though he already knew the answer from her reaction. She nodded, wiping tears from her cheeks. "Mother, father, both alive, both at refugee center." Her voice broke slightly. "Thought me dead, mourned me, now hope again." Relief washed over Ethan, for her sake, for the miracle of family found against impossible odds. "That's wonderful," he said, meaning it despite the complicated emotions the news stirred within him. "Truly wonderful." Nyara turned to him, her expression a complex mixture of joy and conflict. "They say others survived too. My mother's sister, several community elders, children." She took a deep breath. "They rebuilding on New World. Federation helped find place, safe place, far from trafficking routes." The implication hung in the air between them. Her family, her people, were establishing a new home, a place where Nyara could reconnect with her culture, live among her own kind, perhaps heal from her trauma in ways that might never be possible on Epsilon 7. "You should respond," Ethan said, pushing aside his own feelings to focus on what was best for her. "Let them know you're safe, that you received their message." Nyara nodded agreement, but made no move toward the communications unit. Instead, she crossed to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape that had been her home these past months. The hope flower stood tall against the white backdrop, its luminescent blooms pulsing gently in the pale sunlight. "We'll respond," she said finally, "but need time. Need to think." She turned back to face him, her violet eyes holding his steadily. "Not simple decision." Ethan moved to join her at the window, deliberately maintaining a small distance, giving her space to process. "Your family believes you're dead," he reminded her gently. "Whatever you decide about the future, they deserve to know you're alive." "Yes," she agreed. "We'll tell them. Today." She reached out, closing the distance he had left, taking his hand in hers. "But future decisions, where to go, what to do, these need careful thought. Need to consider all factors." By all factors, Ethan knew she meant him, them, the life they had begun to build together. The knowledge both warmed and troubled him. He wanted her happiness above all else, but feared that her loyalty, her sense of debt to him, might influence her to make choices against her own best interests. "Nyara," he said carefully, "I want you to know that whatever you decide, I'll understand. Your family, your people, they're part of who you are. If being with them is what you need." "Stop!" she interrupted, squeezing his hand firmly. Not deciding now. Not rushing. Too important. Her expression softened. Last night meant what said. You are home too now. Not simple to leave one home for another. The drone would remain for 3 days before automatically returning to the settlement, giving them time to load any outgoing cargo or messages. 3 days for Niara to craft her response to her family, to begin navigating the impossible choice that lay before her. They spent that time in a strange limbo, continuing their daily routines, while acutely aware of the decision looming on the horizon. Niara recorded several messages to her parents, discarding most as inadequate, before finally creating one that satisfied her, a careful balance of joy at their survival, explanation of her current circumstances, and deliberate ambiguity about her future plans. Ethan kept his distance from these recordings, giving her privacy to communicate with her family in her own language, in her own way. He focused instead on cabin maintenance, on preparing the drone for its return journey, on anything that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. The nights were different. As darkness fell each evening, they found themselves drawn together, neither willing to waste the precious time that might be limited. They talked late into the night, sharing memories, hopes, fears, the conversations of people who sense an approaching crossroads and wish to leave nothing significant unsaid. Physical affection between them increased naturally, progressing from tentative touches to the comfortable intimacy of those who have discovered their bodies fit together as seamlessly as their minds. They explored this new dimension of their relationship with the same careful respect that had characterized everything between them, each advance gentle, each boundary approached with explicit consent, each new closeness celebrated as a gift rather than assumed as a right. On the final night before the drone's departure, they lay together on Ethan's cot, Niara's head resting on his chest, his arm curved protectively around her shoulders. The repaired wooden star sat on a small table nearby, watching over them like a benevolent guardian. "What happens?" Niara asked softly. "If I go to family, then wish to return?" The question caught Ethan by surprise. Not the content, but the directness. They had been carefully avoiding explicit discussion of separation, focusing instead on the present, on what they had, rather than what they might lose. "The cabin would be here," he said after a moment. "I would be here. But," he hesitated, wanting to be honest. "The journey isn't simple. Epsilon 7 isn't on regular transport routes. It would require significant resources, special arrangements." Niara nodded against his chest, absorbing this reality. "And if asked you to come with me? To meet family, see new settlement?" This possibility had occurred to Ethan. Of course, but he had dismissed it as impractical. "I haven't left this planet in over 6 years," he said slowly. "Haven't interacted with more than a handful of people. I'm not sure I remember how." She propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him with serious eyes. "Could learn again. As I learned language, cabin systems, trust." Her free hand traced the line of his jaw gently. "Could heal that way too. Beyond walls you built." The suggestion stirred complicated emotions in Ethan. The cabin had been his sanctuary but also his prison, a place to hide from the guilt that had driven him from human society. The thought of leaving, of facing the wider universe again, filled him with dread. And yet, the thought of losing Niara filled him with greater dread still. "I don't know if I can," he admitted, the confession difficult but necessary. "But for you, I would try." She smiled, the expression illuminating her face, even in the dim light. "Not deciding now," she reminded him, settling back against his chest. "Just exploring possibilities. All paths open still." They fell silent, each contemplating the uncertain future that lay before them. Outside, Epsilon 7's perpetual winter continued its reign. Inside, warmth persisted against all odds, Morning brought a heavy snowfall, thick flakes drifting past the windows in hypnotic patterns. They prepared the drone for its return journey, loading Niara's message to her family, along with a formal note of thanks to Administrator Torres for her discretion and assistance. As the departure time approached, Niara stood before the communications unit, suddenly hesitant. "Want to add something," she said. "To family message. Decided during night?" Ethan nodded and stepped back, giving her privacy. She recorded briefly in her native language, the melodic sounds rising and falling with emotional cadence. When she finished, she looked up at him with a mixture of resolution and vulnerability. "Told them about you," she explained. "About us. About how you saved me. How we saved each other. How cabin became home." She took a deep breath. "Asked them to understand that decision not simple now. Need time." The admission touched Ethan deeply. By explicitly acknowledging their relationship to her family, Niara had given it substance beyond the isolated bubble of the cabin. She had made it real in the wider context of her life, her culture, her potential future. "Thank you," he said simply, knowing she would understand all he meant by those inadequate words. They loaded the final message onto the drone and initiated the launch sequence. As the machine lifted off, carrying their communications back to the distant settlement and ultimately to Niara's waiting family, they stood shoulder to shoulder, watching until it disappeared from view. "Now we wait again," Niara said softly. Ethan nodded, taking her hand in his. Together, the days that followed took on a dreamlike quality, a period of suspended animation between what had been and what would be. They continued their routines, their lessons, their gradual improvements to the cabin. But beneath every action lay the awareness that change was coming, that decisions would need to be made, that the cocoon of isolation they had shared could not remain indefinitely unbroken. Their hope flower continued its improbable flourishing, now sporting dozens of luminescent blooms that transformed the area around the cabin into a garden of ethereal light. Niara collected more of its sap, storing it carefully in small containers. When Ethan questioned this increasing stockpile, she explained that Larian tradition held that plants grown in difficult conditions produced substances with unique properties. Survival knowledge, she called it, encoded in molecular form. "Taking essence with us," she said. "Wherever we go, reminder of what grew here, what survived here." The casual "we" in her statement did not escape Ethan's notice, nor the implication that regardless of the decision made, some form of departure was anticipated. He didn't press for clarification, respecting her need to process possibilities in her own time, her own way. Weeks passed with no further communication from the settlement or from Proxima Station. Winter's grip on Epsilon 7 began to ease marginally, the perpetual twilight brightening slightly as the planet's axial tilt shifted toward its version of spring. The storms became less frequent, the temperatures occasionally rising enough that brief excursions outside required less extensive protective gear. During one such mild period, they ventured further from the cabin than usual, exploring a ridgeline that offered views across the vast, snow-covered plains. Standing at this elevation, the true isolation of their existence became starkly apparent. Nothing but white emptiness stretching to the horizon in all directions, broken only by the distant silhouette of abandoned mining equipment and the small, dark spot that was their cabin. "Beautiful," Niara said unexpectedly, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "In strange way. Clean, pure." Ethan looked at the landscape through her eyes, trying to see beyond the harshness to the stark beauty she perceived. "I've only ever seen it as hostile," he admitted. "Something to endure rather than appreciate." She smiled, her expression thoughtful. "Many things change when seen through new eyes." She turned to him, snowflakes catching in her dark hair. "You helped me see safety where once saw only danger. Perhaps I help you see beauty where once saw only hostility. The observation was profound in its simplicity. They had indeed transformed each other's perceptions, each bringing perspective the other lacked. Together, they had created something neither could have found alone, not just physical survival, but emotional resurrection, a reclamation of hope and connection that defied the barren landscape surrounding them. That evening, as they sat before the fire reviewing the day's language lesson, the communications unit suddenly activated, its alert tone breaking the quiet. An incoming transmission, the first they had received that wasn't directly tied to the supply drone's scheduled visits. Ethan moved quickly to the console, checking the source identifier. "It's from Torres," he said, tension evident in his voice. Unscheduled communications were rarely bearers of good news on the frontier. The message was brief, but momentous. "Transport vessel Horizon's Reach will make planetary approach in 3 days' time for special extraction mission. Coordinates and authentication codes attached. One-time opportunity approved through humanitarian channels. 2 passenger capacity. Destination: Proxima Station. Decision required before departure. Confirm receipt immediately. Torres." Nyara stood frozen, the language materials forgotten in her hands. "They coming here," she whispered. "For me. For us." "It appears so," Ethan confirmed, scanning the technical details. Torres must have arranged it through her Federation contacts. A humanitarian extraction, technically, a refugee rescue operation. He looked up at Nyara, seeing the complex emotions playing across her face. "It's real. A way to reach your family." And just like that, the theoretical became concrete. The possibility of leaving Epsilon 7th, of reuniting with her people, of starting a new chapter. It was no longer a distant abstraction, but an imminent reality requiring immediate decision. Nyara moved to the window, looking out at the hope flower glowing softly in the darkness. 3 days, she said quietly. To decide future. Ethan sent the required confirmation of receipt, then joined her at the window. He deliberately maintained a small distance, not wanting to influence her with proximity, with the physical connection that had grown so important to both of them. "Not my decision," he said carefully. "This is about your life, your family. Whatever you choose. I'll understand." She turned to him, her expression uncharacteristically fierce. "Stop that," she said firmly. "Stop pretending not your decision too. Stop acting like doesn't matter to you. Stop." Her voice caught slightly. "Stop giving me permission to leave you." The directness of her response startled him. "I just don't want you to feel obligated," he tried to explain. "After everything you've been through, you deserve complete freedom to choose what's best for you, without worrying about my feelings." "And if best for me includes you," she challenged, "if don't want freedom from you, but freedom with you?" She stepped closer, eliminating the distance he had created. Not making decision alone, making together, as partners, as... She searched for the right word. As family we chose, not family born to. The simple declaration struck Ethan deeply. Family, not by blood, but by choice, by shared experience, by mutual recognition of something essential in each other. It was a concept he had abandoned years ago, convinced that meaningful connection was behind him, that isolation was his deserved fate. "All right," he agreed softly. "Together." They spent the remainder of the evening discussing possibilities, weighing options with the careful consideration they deserved. The transport vessel offered a rare opportunity. Ships almost never came to Epsilon 7th since the mining operations had ceased. If they declined this chance, another might not come for years, if ever. Proxima Station would allow Nyara to reunite with her family, to connect with other survivors from her settlement, to begin healing from her trauma with the support of those who shared her culture and experiences. For Ethan, it would mean re-entering society after years of self-imposed exile, facing not just his personal demons, but the practical challenges of adaptation to communal living. Staying on Epsilon 7th meant continued isolation, limited resources, and the harsh reality of a planet never meant for long-term habitation. But it also meant independence, self-determination, and the simple life they had built together, one free from the complexities and potential dangers of the wider universe. As they talked through the night, one truth became increasingly clear. Whatever decision they made, they would make it together. The bond forged between them in this isolated cabin had become too precious, too essential to sacrifice, regardless of the physical location in which their future unfolded. Morning found them still awake, the conversation having evolved from practical considerations to deeper reflections on what they wanted from life, what they hoped to build together, what dreams might be possible beyond basic survival. "One thing's certain," Niara said as pale light began to filter through the windows. "Whatever choose, no regrets for time here, for finding you in storm, for healing together." Ethan nodded agreement, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face with gentle fingers. "No regrets," he echoed. "Whatever comes next." They allowed themselves a few hours of rest before beginning preparations. Whether they decided to leave or stay, the transport vessel's arrival would require preparation, either packing essential belongings for departure or preparing a formal decline of the extraction offer. As Niara organized her few possessions, the Larian artifacts salvaged from her escape pod, the clothing she had adapted to her smaller frame, the educational materials she had studied so diligently, her movements were unhurried, methodical rather than anxious. Whatever decision they reached, she was approaching it with characteristic thoughtfulness rather than reactive emotion. Ethan, meanwhile, found himself unexpectedly emotional as he surveyed the cabin that had been his home, his sanctuary, and his prison for 6 long years. Every corner held memories of isolation and loneliness. Yes, but increasingly of connection, of shared moments, of a life reclaimed from the ashes of guilt and grief. The wooden star caught his attention, sitting on Niara's pillow where she had placed it months ago as a symbol of safe harbor. He picked it up carefully, running his fingers over the mended fractures that had once seemed irreparable. "Taking this," Niara said from behind him, having finished her own preparations. "If we go, important symbol now, of broken things made whole again." Ethan turned to her, the star cradled in his palm. "We really could leave," he said, the reality of it suddenly striking him fully. "Start something new. Together." She nodded, her expression serene despite the magnitude of the potential change before them. "Or stay," knowing chose freely. Either way, chose life, not just survival. She took the star from his hand and placed it carefully in a small pack along with her other treasured items. "Decided yet?" Ethan considered the question, searching his heart for the truth. The cabin had served its purpose, a place of penance, of healing, of reconnection with what mattered. Whether they remained or departed, that healing had begun, that reconnection established. The walls, the location, the isolation, they were no longer necessary components of his identity or his path forward. "I think," he said slowly, "I'm ready for whatever comes next, with you." Niara smiled, understanding all he meant by those simple words. "Then, decision is clear," she said. "We go. Meet family. See stars again. Find new home, or perhaps return here someday with new eyes." She touched his face gently. Breaking isolation not same as breaking connection. Some bonds travel across space. The rightness of this decision settled over Ethan, like a weight lifting rather than descending. The prospect of leaving Epsilon 7th, of facing the wider universe again, still filled him with apprehension. But the prospect of continued growth, of seeing Niara reunited with her family, of building something beyond mere survival, These outweighed the fear. The following 2 days were a flurry of practical activity. They prepared the cabin for potential extended absence, shutting down non-essential systems, securing exterior access points, preserving what might be useful if they ever returned. They gathered the few possessions worth taking: practical items, personal treasures, seeds from their hope flower carefully preserved in Niara's collected sap. On the final evening before the transport's scheduled arrival, they stood together outside the cabin, watching their hope flower glow in the gathering darkness. The plant had grown from a single struggling seedling to a vibrant, thriving presence that defied the hostile environment with luminescent beauty. "We'll miss this," Niara admitted, leaning against Ethan's side. "Our first creation together. We'll grow others," he promised. "In better soil, with more light." She smiled up at him. "Yes, but always remember this one. What taught us? That life finds way, even in coldest places." They returned to the cabin for their last night on Epsilon 7, the preparations complete, their decision made. As they settled onto their now shared sleeping space, the wooden star watching over them from its place of honor, a sense of completion enveloped them. Not an ending, but a transition. A chapter closing so another could begin. Morning brought clear skies and relative calm. Ideal conditions for the transport's arrival. They donned their thermal gear and moved their small collection of belongings outside. Then sealed the cabin one final time. Standing beside their packs, they surveyed the structure that had been the entire world for both of them during these transformative months. "Goodbye, little home," Niara said softly in her native language, the melodic sounds carrying on the cold air. "Thank you for your shelter, your warmth, your protection." Ethan didn't understand the specific words, but he understood the sentiment. This humble structure had been the crucible of their healing, the birthplace of their connection, the sanctuary that had allowed both of them to reclaim their humanity after different but equally profound losses. The approaching transport appeared first as a distant speck in the pale sky, then gradually resolved into a sleek vessel designed for planetary landings. It descended with precision, touching down on the flat area some 50 meters from the cabin, the same spot where the supply drones typically landed, but occupying a much larger footprint. As the engines powered down, a hatch opened in the side of the vessel. A figure emerged, heavily bundled against Epsilon's cold, and approached them with purposeful strides. "Ethan Mercer," a female voice called through her helmet's external speaker. "And companion, I'm Captain Lin of the Horizon's Reach. Administrator Torres arranged this pickup." Ethan stepped forward, strangely formal after years without human contact, beyond Torres's occasional messages. "Yes, thank you for coming." The captain nodded briskly. "We have a 40-minute window before atmospheric conditions deteriorate. If you're coming, we need to board now." Niara moved to Ethan's side, her gloved hand finding his. "We ready," she said with quiet confidence. They gathered their few belongings and followed Captain Lin to the waiting vessel. At the hatch, Ethan paused for one final look at the cabin, at the hope flower glowing even in daylight, at the small sanctuary they had shared, at the past they were choosing to leave behind. "Stay with me forever," he said softly to Niara, echoing the words he had once offered in simple comfort to a traumatized refugee, now transformed into a promise between equals. She squeezed his hand, understanding the significance of the repeated phrase. "Always," she replied, using one of the first Federation standard words she had mastered in their shared home. Together, they stepped into the transport, the hatch closing behind them with a decisive thud. As the vessel lifted off, carrying them away from Epsilon 7 toward a future neither could fully predict, they held tight to each other, two beings who had found each other against impossible odds, who had healed each other's wounds, who had discovered that even in the coldest, most desolate corners of the universe, hope could take root and flourish. Outside the viewport, as the cabin and its glowing plant receded into the distance, Niara pointed to something unexpected. Footprints in the snow, leading toward their former home. Fresh tracks, not their own, approaching from the direction of the abandoned mining facility. "Someone coming," she observed with surprise. "After we left." Ethan studied the tracks, a reminder that no story truly ends, that life continues in unexpected ways, even after principal characters exit the stage. Who these new visitors might be, survivors, explorers, threats, or opportunities, would remain a mystery, a future tale untold. "I hope they find what they need there," he said simply, watching the scene diminish as the transport gained altitude. Niara nodded agreement, then turned away from the viewport to face forward, toward their destination, toward reunion and new beginnings. "Our story continues elsewhere now," she said, her voice strong with conviction. The transport broke through Epsilon 7's atmosphere, leaving behind the perpetual twilight for the stark brilliance of space. Stars surrounded them, countless points of light that had been invisible from the planet's surface. Niara gazed at them in wonder, her violet eyes reflecting their distant fire. Ethan watched her face, finding in her expression everything he needed to know about the decision they had made. Whatever challenges lay ahead, adaptation to society, reunion with her family, building a life beyond isolation, they would face them as they had faced the brutal winter of Epsilon 7th, together, drawing strength from each other, finding light in darkness. The wooden star sat between them, its mended fractures now part of its beauty, rather than flaws to be hidden. Like the beings who carried it, it had been broken, then rebuilt with care and patience. Like them, it was stronger at the places where it had been repaired, more valuable for having been restored rather than discarded. As the transport accelerated toward Proxima Station, toward reunion and new possibility, Ethan and Niara leaned against each other, no longer aliens but family, not by birth, but by choice, by recognition, by the simple, profound miracle of finding home in another's presence. She had had no home, no clothes, no hope, until a human whispered, "Stay with me forever." Now, together, they carried that forever forward into the waiting stars. She had no home, no clothes, no hope, until a human whispered, "Stay with me forever." The wind howled across the frozen wasteland, carrying ice crystals that stung like needles against exposed skin. It was the kind of cold that didn't just freeze the body, but seemed to reach deeper, freezing the soul itself. In this desolate corner of Epsilon 7th, a frontier colony world long past its prime, stood a solitary cabin, once part of a thriving mining outpost. It now remained as one of the few structures still inhabited after the great corporate exodus. Inside this cabin, Ethan Mercer sat before a small fire, his rough hands methodically cleaning the parts of a weather monitor. The orange glow danced across his weathered face, highlighting scars both visible and hidden. 6 years of isolation had taught him to find comfort in routine. Wake at first light, check the perimeter, maintain equipment, conserve resources, repeat. The mining colony's collapse had left him behind, one of the handful who couldn't or wouldn't return to Earth. Now he was simply a hermit, a remnant of humanity clinging to existence on this frozen rock. A sudden gust rattled the reinforced windows, drawing Ethan's attention momentarily from his work. The storm was intensifying, Category 3 by colony standards, which meant staying indoors for at least 48 hours. He had prepared for this, as he prepared for everything, methodically, carefully, leaving nothing to chance. Survival didn't allow for mistakes. He placed the reassembled monitor on its shelf and moved to check his supplies once more. Food for 2 weeks, water recycler at 93% efficiency, backup generator primed, everything in order, as always. His gaze lingered on the cracked wooden star that sat on his nightstand, the only personal item he had kept from before. He never touched it anymore, but couldn't bring himself to discard it either. Some wounds never fully healed. They just became part of who you are. The perimeter alarm suddenly blared, its harsh tone cutting through the howling wind. Ethan frowned. Nothing triggered those sensors during storms this severe. Not the indigenous fauna. Not the automated drones occasionally sent from the nearest functioning outpost some 300 kilometers away. He moved to the security console and squinted at the grainy feed. A shape lay crumpled in the snow, barely visible through the swirling white, smaller than a snow wolf, motionless except for what might have been the flutter of fabric, or perhaps a limb in the wind. "Damn it," Ethan muttered. It wouldn't be the first time someone had tried to reach his cabin during a storm, seeking shelter or supplies. The last attempt had been a trap, leaving him with the scar that ran from his left shoulder to his elbow. He had learned his lesson then. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. And yet, the shape didn't move like a threat. It didn't move at all. Cursing his own weakness, Ethan activated the external scanner. No energy signatures that would indicate weapons or tech. Just a faint biological reading. And it was fading fast. He donned his thermal suit, checked his stunner, and sealed his helmet. The airlock hissed as he stepped into the antechamber, the pressure equalizing before the outer door opened to the storm's fury. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet as he stepped outside, the visibility reduced to mere meters. He followed the scanner's guidance, moving cautiously toward the shape in the snow. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a form that made him stop short. It was a girl. No, not quite human. Her skin had a faint bluish tinge, visible even through the accumulating snow, and what appeared to be small ridges traced her exposed spine. She lay face down, unmoving, with no protective clothing against the killing cold. Her body was marked with bruises, and what looked disturbingly like brands burned into her flesh. Ethan hesitated only a moment before making his decision. Whatever she was, whoever she was, she would die within minutes if left out here. He knelt and carefully turned her over, confirming she was still breathing, barely. Her features were almost human, but with subtle differences. Slightly elongated eyes, a more pronounced brow, ears that tapered to points. He had seen her kind before, rarely, on the trading vessels that occasionally visited the colony in its better days. Larian, if he remembered correctly, a species from a system several jumps away. He lifted her with ease. She weighed almost nothing, her body frail and undernourished. Securing her against his chest, he trudged back to the cabin, the wind pushing against him as if the planet itself objected to his act of mercy. Inside the airlock, he brushed snow from both of them before entering the cabin proper. The sudden warmth was a shock after the brutal cold outside. He placed her gently on his cot and quickly assessed her condition. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse weak and erratic. Frostbite threatened her extremities, and old injuries crisscrossed her body, some partially healed, others freshly scabbed. Ethan worked methodically, applying thermal wraps to her core and extremities, administering the limited medical treatments his first aid kit allowed. He carefully avoided looking at her naked form more than necessary, preserving what dignity he could for her. When he had done all he could, he covered her with his thickest blanket and stepped back. Now came the waiting. And the questions. Who was she? How had she come to be outside his cabin, on this abandoned edge of nowhere, without even clothes to protect her? The brands on her skin suggested answers he didn't want to contemplate. Human trafficking was outlawed throughout known space. But alien trafficking, that existed in the shadows, especially in frontier worlds where law enforcement was stretched thin or non-existent. Hours passed. The storm continued its assault on the cabin, but inside, a fragile bubble of warmth held steady. Ethan sat on his workbench, the stunner within reach, watching the slow rise and fall of the stranger's chest. He had saved her life, but what came next? If she survived, what would he do with her? His isolation was not just circumstance, but choice. He had left human connection behind years ago, after what happened at the colony's main facility. The girl stirred, a small sound escaping her lips. Ethan tensed, hand moving to his weapon. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises of deep violet, another non-human trait. She looked around in confusion before her gaze settled on him. Fear immediately flooded her features, and she tried to scramble backward, tangling herself in the blanket and nearly falling from the cot. Ethan raised his hands, palms out. "Easy," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "You're safe." The girl pressed herself against the wall, clutching the blanket to her chest. Her eyes darted around the cabin, searching for exits, for threats, for anything familiar. "Do you understand me?" Ethan asked, keeping his distance. "Federation standard. I found you in the snow. You were dying." She stared at him, uncomprehending or unwilling to respond. Ethan sighed and moved slowly to his supply cabinet. He retrieved a container of water and placed it on the floor, then slid it toward her with his foot before backing away again. "Water," he said, mimicking drinking. "Safe." The girl looked from him to the container, distrust evident in her posture, but thirst eventually won out. She reached for the water with trembling hands and drank greedily. "Slow," Ethan cautioned, miming again. "Too fast will make you sick." She either understood or had learned this lesson before, as she slowed her drinking. When she had finished, she placed the container carefully on the floor and pushed it back toward him, a small gesture that spoke volumes about her awareness of exchange and debt. "Food next," Ethan said, turning to prepare a simple broth. He could feel her eyes on his back, watching his every move. He kept his motions deliberate and unthreatening. When he turned back with the bowl, he found her examining the blanket with curious fingers, as if unfamiliar with the texture. He placed the broth on the floor and backed away again, allowing her space. "Food," he said. "Eat." This time, she moved more quickly, though still with caution. She sniffed the broth before tasting it, then consumed it with the desperation of the truly hungry. Ethan watched with a mixture of pity and concern. Whatever her story, it clearly involved prolonged deprivation. When she finished, she looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not quite gratitude, not quite fear, something in between, tinged with confusion. "Ethan," he said, pointing to himself. It had been so long since he'd introduced himself to anyone that the name felt strange on his tongue. She tilted her head, considering. Her lips moved, forming the syllables silently before she attempted to speak. "Ethan." Her voice was soft, melodic despite its hesitancy. He nodded, pointing to her now. "And you?" She looked down, shoulders hunching. After a long moment, she shook her head. No name, or not willing to share it. Either possibility spoke of trauma. Ethan didn't push. Instead, he moved to a storage trunk and pulled out some of his smaller clothes, a thermal shirt, pants, socks. He placed them on the edge of the cot. "Clothes," he said. "For you. I'll turn around." He faced the wall, giving her privacy. He heard the rustle of fabric, a few small sounds of confusion, then silence. When he turned back, she had managed to dress herself, though the clothes hung loosely on her thin frame. She had rolled up the sleeves and pant legs to make them fit better. "Good," he said, offering what he hoped was a reassuring smile. It felt strange on his face after so long. "Rest now. You're safe here." She didn't look convinced, but exhaustion was clearly overtaking her. Her eyelids drooped despite her obvious efforts to stay alert. Eventually, she curled up on the cot, the blanket pulled tight around her, facing the room rather than the wall, keeping him in her sight even as sleep claimed her. Ethan watched her for a moment before returning to his workbench. The storm would keep them both confined to the cabin for at least another day. In that time, he needed to figure out what to do. The right thing would be to contact authorities once communications were possible again. But there were no real authorities left on this part of Epsilon 7. The corporate security that had once maintained order had departed with the mining operations. What remained was a patchwork of settlements, each with its own rules, none with the resources or inclination to help a trafficked alien. He glanced at the girl's sleeping form. Taking her in had been instinct, humanity's better nature briefly overriding his hard-earned caution. But now what? He had barely enough supplies for himself. His isolation was deliberate, a penance for past failures. He wasn't equipped to be anyone's savior or protector. And yet, turning her out wasn't an option. Not into the merciless cold. Not back to whatever circumstances had left her branded and abandoned. Ethan rubbed his face, feeling the rough stubble beneath his palms. One day at a time. Get her healthy, establish communication, then figure out the next step. That was all he could do. Outside, the storm raged on, oblivious to the small drama unfolding within the cabin's walls. Inside, an unlikely pair, a human hermit and an alien refugee, had found temporary sanctuary in a hostile world. Whether that sanctuary would last beyond the storm remained to be seen. Morning arrived, though on Epsilon 7th, morning merely meant a slightly lighter shade of perpetual twilight. The storm had weakened overnight, but still made venturing outside inadvisable. Ethan woke from his uncomfortable position in the chair where he dozed, instantly alert as he registered the sounds of movement. The girl was awake, standing beside the cot, examining the cracked wooden star on his nightstand with careful fingers. When she noticed his gaze, she quickly withdrew her hand, eyes wide with apprehension. "It's all right," Ethan said, stretching to ease the stiffness in his back. "Just an old reminder." She didn't respond, but her posture relaxed slightly when no reprimand came. Ethan moved slowly to the small kitchen area and began preparing a simple breakfast. He was acutely aware of her watching him, studying his movements with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing everything, a survival skill, no doubt. "Hungry?" he asked, glancing back at her. She nodded slightly, the first clear communication she had offered. Progress, of a sort. As they ate, Ethan at his workbench, the girl perched on the edge of the cot, he considered how to bridge the language gap. Federation standard was widely used across human space and among many alien cultures that traded with humans. But it was clear she either didn't speak it or was unwilling to. He needed another approach. After they finished eating, Ethan retrieved an old datapad. The device was outdated but functional, with a basic drawing program. He sketched a simple figure of the cabin, then a crude representation of the storm outside, followed by a figure lying in the snow. He handed the pad to her, watching as she studied the images. Understanding dawned in her eyes. She took the stylus from him hesitantly and added to his drawing, a group of figures with weapons pursuing a smaller figure that was clearly meant to be her. The last pursuer had a distinctive emblem on what appeared to be a uniform. Ethan frowned. "Someone was chasing you," he said, even though she might not understand the words. He pointed to the emblem. "Who are they?" She shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. Fear radiated from her in palpable waves. Whoever these pursuers were, they had left deep trauma in their wake. Ethan took the pad back and cleared the screen. He drew a simple question mark, then handed it to her again. After a moment's hesitation, she began to draw. Her strokes were uncertain at first, then grew more confident. She sketched what appeared to be a ship, angular and utilitarian. Next to it, She drew several figures being loaded into cargo containers. One of the figures had the same pointed ears as her. Human trafficking. No. Alien trafficking. Ethan's jaw tightened. Such operations existed on the fringes of civilization, supplying exotic servants, laborers, or worse, to those with money and no moral compass. Federation patrols occasionally busted these operations, but for everyone they caught, 3 more took their place. "You escaped," he said, more to himself than to her. "And they followed you here." The girl drew another image, what looked like a small transport craft crashing into the snow. She pointed to herself, then to the crash site on the drawing. "Your escape pod crashed," Ethan surmised, "and you walked here." He couldn't imagine how she had survived even a short time in Epsilon 7's brutal environment without protection. The will to live that drove her must have been extraordinary. He took the pad again and sketched a new image. The cabin with 2 stick figures inside, safe from the elements. He added a simple barricade at the door. Then he pointed to himself, mimed strength, and pointed to the barricade drawing. "Safe," he said firmly. "You're safe here." She studied his face, searching for deception, finding none. She gave a tiny nod. Over the next several hours, they continued this rudimentary communication. Ethan learned that she had been part of a group of aliens captured from various outpost worlds, destined for sale in some black market on a core world. She had been held captive for what seemed like months, based on her drawings of sleep cycles. The escape had been opportunistic, a guard's error during a routine transfer. Several captives had fled, but she didn't know what had happened to the others. In turn, Ethan conveyed simple information about the cabin, the planet, and himself. He showed her how the heating system worked, where to find water, which storage containers held food. He marked areas that were safe to touch and those that weren't. Throughout it all, he maintained a respectful distance, moved slowly, and kept his voice calm and even. By midday, the storm had abated enough that Ethan needed to check the exterior of the cabin for damage. He indicated his intentions through drawings and gestures, making it clear she should stay inside where it was warm. She watched with apprehension as he donned his thermal suit. "I'll be back," he said, pointing to himself, then the door, then back to himself. "Stay." Outside, the landscape was transformed by the storm. Snowdrifts rose nearly to the windows on the north side of the cabin. Ethan trudged through the deep snow, checking the exterior walls, the roof supports, and the communications array, damaged again, as he'd expected. It would take days to repair properly. As he worked, his mind kept returning to the girl in his cabin. Her presence complicated everything. He had supplies for one person, carefully rationed. He had routines designed for solitude. More importantly, he had built walls around himself, not just the physical walls of the cabin, but emotional barriers constructed after the mining disaster that had claimed 43 lives. Lives he should have saved, if he'd only identified the structural weakness sooner. He had come to terms with his isolation, his penance. This girl threatened to disrupt that careful equilibrium. And yet, turning her away was unthinkable. The brands on her skin, the fear in her eyes, they spoke of horrors he couldn't ignore. Whatever his own burdens, they didn't justify abandoning another being to suffering. When he returned to the cabin, he found her huddled by the window, watching for him. Relief visibly washed over her face when he appeared in the doorway, quickly masked, but unmistakable. She had feared he wouldn't return. He realized that he had abandoned her, or perhaps that her pursuers had found him. "Still here," he said, removing his outer gear. "As promised." That evening, as they shared another simple meal, Ethan noticed her studying him with less fear and more curiosity. When he caught her eye, she didn't look away immediately as she had before. Instead, she pointed to the scar on his forearm, visible where he had rolled up his sleeve. Ethan glanced down at the old injury. A reminder to be careful who you trust, he said, knowing she wouldn't understand the words but might grasp the tone. This place isn't kind to the careless. She nodded slowly. Then, to his surprise, extended her arm, revealing a pattern of scars that could only have been deliberately inflicted. She met his gaze steadily, a silent communication passing between them. I understand pain. I have survived it too. In that moment, something shifted between them. Not quite trust, but a recognition of shared experience. They were both survivors in a hostile universe. Different species, different traumas, but the same fundamental struggle to endure. Ethan cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the sudden emotional weight in the room. He stood and moved to the communications console, busying himself with diagnostics that he knew would show the same damage as before. The girl watched for a while, then curled up on the cot, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. That night, as Ethan tried to find a comfortable position in his chair, he heard a small sound from the cot. The girl was whimpering in her sleep, her body twitching as if trying to escape unseen hands. A nightmare, hardly surprising given what she had endured. Without thinking, Ethan moved to her side and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Shh," he murmured. "You're safe. No one will hurt you here." She jolted awake, eyes wild with terror until recognition dawned. She didn't pull away from his touch, a small victory of trust. Instead, she took several deep breaths, visibly calming herself. Ethan removed his hand and sat on the edge of the cot. "The nightmares," he said softly. "They don't ever completely go away, but they get less frequent, less intense." He wasn't sure why he was speaking when she couldn't understand, but somehow it felt important to say the words aloud. "You learn to live with them, eventually." She watched his face as he spoke, and though she couldn't comprehend the words, something in his tone or expression seemed to reach her. She nodded slightly, then surprised him by touching her chest and making a soft, musical sound. "Area." "Area," Ethan repeated. "That's your name?" She nodded again, more confidently. "Area," she confirmed, then pointed to him. "Ethan." He smiled, a genuine expression that felt foreign on his face. "That's right. Ethan and Araya." It was a small step, this exchange of names, but somehow it felt momentous in the quiet of the cabin. Identity was a powerful thing, especially for someone who had likely been treated as property rather than a person. By sharing her name, Iria had reclaimed a piece of herself. The days that followed fell into a tentative rhythm. Each morning, Ethan would check the cabin systems and prepare food while Iria observed. He showed her how to operate simple machinery, how to check the water recycler, how to seal the airlock properly. She proved to be a quick study, watching his demonstrations intently before attempting tasks herself. Communication improved gradually. Ethan created a rudimentary picture dictionary on the datapad, associating images with Federation standard words. Iria began to recognize and even speak some basic terms. Water, food, cold, warm, safe. Each new word seemed to delight her, as if language itself was a luxury she had been denied. The weather stabilized enough for Ethan to make exterior repairs. Iria would watch anxiously from the window until he returned, her relief palpable each time he stepped back through the airlock. On the 5th day, she surprised him by having hot broth ready when he came in from the cold, a small gesture that affected him more deeply than he cared to admit. Through their limited communication, Ethan pieced together more of her story. Iria's people, the Larians, were a peaceful species known for their artistic abilities and natural empathy. These very traits made them targets for traffickers, who sold them as exotic servants or entertainers to wealthy collectors. Iria had been captured during a raid on a small Larian settlement on a frontier moon. Her family's fate remained unknown to her, a source of ongoing grief visible in her eyes whenever the subject arose. As for the brands on her skin, Ethan's suspicions were confirmed. They were ownership marks, a barbaric practice that designated which trafficking syndicate claimed her. The largest mark, positioned at the base of her neck, belonged to a notorious operation known as the Vermilion Chain. Ruthless, even by trafficker standards, with connections to corrupt officials throughout the sector. This revelation troubled Ethan deeply. The Vermilion Chain didn't abandon valuable merchandise easily. If Aria had escaped during transport, they would be searching for her, and they had resources far beyond anything Ethan could muster in defense. On the seventh day, as Ethan finally managed to repair the communications array, these fears materialized into reality. The long-range scanner, now functioning again, detected an approaching vessel, too large to be a routine supply drone, too small to be a corporate ship. Its trajectory suggested it was searching methodically, grid by grid. Ethan watched the scanner with growing unease. The cabin's location wasn't on any official maps. He had made sure of that when he chose exile, but determined searchers with the right equipment could eventually find it, especially if they were tracking the unique biomarkers of a Larian. When he showed Aria the scanner readings, her reaction confirmed his fears. She began to tremble, her newly acquired vocabulary deserting her as panic took hold. She made frantic gestures, pointing to the brands on her skin, then to the approaching ship, then mimicking restraints around her wrists. "They're coming for you," Ethan said grimly. "The Vermilion Chain doesn't give up easily." Aria's eyes filled with tears. She grabbed his arm, her fingers digging in with surprising strength, and spoke a torrent of words in her native language. Though he couldn't understand the specific meaning, her message was clear. "Help me. Don't let them take me." Ethan gently disengaged her grip and moved to the weapon cabinet he had hoped never to open again. Inside lay remnants of his former life, not just the tools of an engineer, but the implements of a survivor from a colony gone wrong. Sonic disruptors, jury-rigged proximity mines, an old model pulse rifle that had seen better days. "I'm not much of a fighter," he told Aria as he began checking the equipment. "But this cabin has some surprises. Mining outposts had to deal with claim jumpers and worse. We learned to protect what was ours." He set to work immediately, activating dormant security systems and placing traps at strategic points around the cabin's perimeter. Aria watched with solemn attention, then began to help without being asked, handing him tools, holding components steady, learning the defense preparations as readily as she had learned cabin maintenance. As they worked, Ethan found himself talking more than he had in years, explaining each step partially to distract Aria from her fear and partially to fill the oppressive silence. "This one will create a sonic field. Painful, but not lethal. This one disrupts electrical systems. And this," he patted a particularly complex device, "is our last resort. It'll collapse the outer entrance if triggered." By nightfall, they had done all they could. The scanner showed the vessel had landed approximately 20 kilometers away, close enough to reach the cabin by ground transport within hours, far enough that they might still be searching other potential crash sites first. Ethan secured the cabin for the night, double-checking each system. When he finally sat down, exhausted, he found Aria standing before him with a determined expression. She pointed to herself, then to the weapons, making a gesture that clearly asked, "Teach me." Ethan hesitated. "I don't want you to have to fight," he said. But the resolve in her eyes was unmistakable. This wasn't just about survival. It was about agency. Her right to defend herself after being treated as property for so long. With a sigh, he nodded and showed her how to operate the simplest of the weapons, a stunner similar to his own. Her hands were steady as she practiced aiming, her focus absolute. In that moment, Ethan saw beyond the traumatized victim to the person beneath. Resilient, determined, unwilling to surrender her newfound freedom without a fight. They slept in shifts that night, each taking watch while the other rested. During Ethan's watch, he found himself studying Aria's sleeping face. The bruises had faded, and some weight had returned to her frame in the days she had spent in the cabin. More significant was the change in her eyes when awake. The constant terror had receded, replaced by caution, but also by moments of curiosity, even occasional flashes of something like happiness. She deserved a chance at life, real life, not existence as someone's possession. And if that meant Ethan had to break his isolation, confront the ghosts of his past failures, and stand against a trafficking syndicate, so be it. Morning brought no reprieve. The scanner showed the vessel had moved during the night, now positioned just 5 kilometers away. They were closing in, methodical and inevitable. Ethan and Aria ate a silent breakfast, the weight of approaching confrontation heavy between them. When they finished, Aria touched Ethan's hand to get his attention. She had been working with the datapad while he monitored the scanner, and now she showed him what she had drawn. It was a detailed sketch of the cabin with hidden escape tunnels beneath it, tunnels that didn't exist. She pointed to the drawing, then to the floor, her expression questioning. Ethan shook his head. "No escape routes," he said. "The permafrost makes tunneling nearly impossible. We stand our ground here." She accepted this with a grim nod, then drew another image, herself, alone, walking away from the cabin toward the approaching vessel. Her meaning was clear. She was offering to surrender herself to spare Ethan. "No," he said firmly, taking the pad and crossing out the drawing with decisive strokes. "That's not an option," he added to the image, drawing a protective circle around both of them inside the cabin. Together. Aria's eyes welled with tears, but she nodded, her hand briefly squeezing his in gratitude. The scanner alarm sounded just after midday. A ground transport was approaching, now less than a kilometer away. Ethan moved to the observation port, adjusting the scope to maximum magnification. Through the swirling snow, he could make out a sleek vehicle designed for harsh environments, bearing the crimson emblem of the Vermilion chain. "They're here," he said, turning to Aria. 3 of them, maybe 4, armed. Aria's face went pale, but she straightened her shoulders and took up position at one of the reinforced windows, stunner in hand. Ethan activated the cabin's defensive shields. They wouldn't stop a determined assault for long, but they might buy precious time. The transport halted, just outside the perimeter Ethan had trapped. 3 figures emerged, their features obscured by environmental suits, but their intentions clear from their drawn weapons. They approached, cautiously, scanning for threats, professionals, then, not common thugs. Ethan activated the exterior speakers. "This is private property," he announced. "State your business." The central figure paused, then responded via a comm unit that linked to Ethan's system. "We're retrieving stolen property," a cold voice replied. "A Larian female. Our scanners show she's inside. Hand her over, and we'll leave you in peace." "There's no property here," Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. "Only people." A harsh laugh came through the speaker. "Sentimentality is expensive. Colonist. That merchandise represents a significant investment. The Vermilion chain protects its interests." Ethan glanced at Aria, who stood rigid with fear, but maintained her position. "Leave," he said into the comm. "There's nothing for you here." "Final warning," the voice responded. "Surrender the Larian, or we take her by force, and compensation for our trouble." When Ethan didn't respond, the 3 figures spread out, clearly preparing to approach from different angles. He watched their movements, waiting until the leader stepped into position, then triggered the first trap. A sonic pulse erupted from a hidden emitter, sending the leader staggering backward, clutching at their helmet. The other two immediately opened fire, energy bolts striking the cabin's shields in bright flashes. "Get down!" Ethan shouted to Aria, diving for cover himself as a particularly powerful blast overloaded a section of the shield, allowing projectiles to strike the cabin wall directly. The structure shuddered, but held. Ethan returned fire through a defensive port, forcing one attacker to seek cover behind the transport. The leader had recovered and was coordinating the assault, directing concentrated fire at the shield's weakest point. A warning light flashed on Ethan's console, shield integrity at 60% and falling. They were being systematically dismantled by professionals who had clearly done this before. "Iria," he called. "The basement. There's a secure room." He pointed to a hatch in the floor that had remained closed until now. "Go. Lock yourself in." She shook her head vehemently, firing her stunner through another port at the approaching attackers. Her shot went wide, but her resolve was clear. She would not hide while Ethan fought alone. Another blast rocked the cabin, stronger than before. A section of the shield failed completely, leaving the eastern wall vulnerable. The attackers immediately concentrated their fire there, methodically weakening the structure. Ethan triggered another trap, this one releasing a cloud of metallic particles that interfered with electronic systems. The attackers' weapons sputtered momentarily, but they quickly switched to backup systems. These weren't common traffickers. They were equipped for serious resistance. With a grinding sound that vibrated through the floor, the eastern door began to buckle under sustained assault. Ethan realized with growing dread that they had brought portable cutting equipment. The cabin's defenses were formidable against the elements and opportunistic thieves, but not against a well-equipped retrieval team. "Iria," he said urgently, moving to her side. "Listen to me. They'll breach within minutes. You need to hide." He pointed again to the hatch. "It's reinforced. They won't find you immediately. It might buy enough time for—" She cut him off with a firm gesture, then pointed to herself and made a series of motions, standing tall, speaking, making a formal declaration. She repeated this several times until understanding dawned on Ethan. "Self-declaration," he murmured. "The autonomy protocol." It was a long shot, but not without precedent. Under Federation law, any sentient being could claim personhood status through formal declaration, requiring authorities to recognize their rights as an individual rather than property. The law had been created to address the ethical complexities of artificial intelligence, but had been successfully invoked by other species seeking protection from exploitation. The catch: it had to be witnessed by a representative of Federation authority or recorded for later verification, and it had to be made freely, without coercion. Ethan glanced at the communications array. It was functioning, but barely. Enough to send a simple data burst to the nearest Federation relay. Perhaps, if Aria could make her declaration, and they could transmit it before the traffickers breached the cabin. Worth trying, he decided aloud, moving quickly to the console. But still, get ready to hide if it fails. As he worked to establish a connection to the Federation emergency channel, Aria positioned herself before the cabin's main camera, straightening her borrowed clothes and standing as tall as her slight frame allowed. Her hands trembled, but her expression was resolute. The eastern door gave way with a screech of protesting metal. Ethan triggered the final defensive measure, a localized electromagnetic pulse that would temporarily disable most electronic equipment within range. It wouldn't stop the attackers, but it might slow them enough to complete the transmission. "Now, Aria!" he shouted as the connection stabilized. "Make your declaration!" The camera activated, recording as Aria faced it squarely, in halting but clear Federation standard. She spoke the words she had been practicing silently for days. "I am Aria of Laria. I declare myself a person, not property. I claim protection under Federation Autonomy Protocol, Section 7. Her voice grew stronger with each word. "I have a mind. I have a heart. I have a name. I am not merchandise. I am Area. Ethan hit the transmit button just as the first attacker breached the inner door. Weapon raised. The data burst confirmation flashed green, sent successfully to the Federation relay. "Hold!" Ethan shouted, raising his hands. "She has made declaration under the Autonomy Protocol. It's been recorded and transmitted to Federation authorities." The leader of the retrieval team stepped forward, removing their helmet to reveal features as coldly efficient as their voice. Human. Female. With eyes that had witnessed and perpetrated countless atrocities without remorse. "A clever trick," she said, "but ultimately meaningless. Federation bureaucracy moves slowly, if at all, on the frontier." "Perhaps," Ethan agreed, keeping his body between the traffickers and Iria. "But the Vermilion chain operates in multiple sectors, including those where Federation influence is strong. How will your other operations fare when this violation becomes public? When your identities are attached to a documented case of defying the Autonomy Protocol?" The leader's expression hardened, but Ethan could see calculation behind her eyes. The Vermilion chain was ruthless, but it was also a business, one that relied on operating in the shadows, bribing the right officials, and avoiding the direct attention of Federation authorities. "The girl is damaged goods anyway," she said finally, lowering her weapon slightly. "Merchandise that causes this much trouble rarely proves profitable in the long term." Ethan maintained his steady gaze. "Then we have a solution that works for everyone. You report the merchandise lost in transit. We never saw your faces or recorded your identities." This last part was a bluff. The camera had captured everything, but the traffickers had no way to verify this without searching the cabin systems, which would give Ethan time to trigger the self-destruct protocols. The leader considered this for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. "Consensus is achieved. The merchandise is declared lost." She turned to her companions. "We're done here." As suddenly as they had arrived, the traffickers withdrew, leaving the damaged cabin in eerie silence. Ethan kept his weapon trained on the doorway until the scanner confirmed the transport was moving away, heading back toward their vessel. Only then did he allow himself to exhale, lowering the weapon and turning to Area. She stood exactly where she had made her declaration, trembling with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline but unbroken. "You did it," Ethan said softly. "Your declaration is registered. They can't legally touch you now." Area's composure finally cracked. She sank to her knees, shoulders shaking with silent sobs, not of despair, but of release. Years of captivity, of being treated as an object rather than a person, culminating in this moment of hard-won freedom. Ethan knelt beside her, awkwardly placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he murmured. "They're gone." She looked up at him through tears, then did something unexpected. She threw her arms around him in a fierce embrace. Ethan stiffened, unused to physical contact after years of isolation, but gradually relaxed, returning the embrace gently. They remained that way for several minutes, two damaged souls finding momentary solace in shared victory against a cruel universe. When they finally separated, Iria wiped her tears and gestured around the cabin at the destruction left by the attack. "Yes," Ethan agreed, surveying the damage. "We have work to do." The days that followed were consumed with repairs. The eastern door required complete replacement. Sections of wall needed reinforcement, and the shield generators had to be recalibrated. Ethan worked methodically, as was his nature, but now with a partner who proved increasingly capable. Aria's dexterity and spatial awareness made her well-suited to detail work. She learned to solder connections, patch insulation, and program basic system functions. Each new skill she mastered seemed to strengthen her confidence, to reaffirm her personhood in tangible ways. Communication continued to improve as well. Aria's vocabulary expanded rapidly, and she began constructing simple sentences in Federation Standard. Ethan found himself talking more than he had in years, explaining processes, sharing knowledge, even occasionally relating sanitized stories from his past. One evening, as they sat before the fire after a long day of repairs, Aria pointed to the cracked wooden star that still sat on the nightstand. "What is?" she asked, her grammar still developing but her curiosity clear. Ethan was silent for so long that she seemed to think she had overstepped. She began to apologize, but he shook his head. "No, it's all right," he said. "It's a reminder from before." He took a deep breath, deciding after years of silence to share the burden he carried. "I was chief structural engineer for the mining operation here, responsible for safety inspections, maintenance protocols, stability assessments. I was good at my job, until I wasn't." He stared into the fire, seeing not flames but memories. There were signs, microfractures in the primary support beams, unusual settling patterns. I documented them, recommended immediate evacuation and reinforcement. But the corporate supervisors overruled me, said the productivity quotas couldn't be interrupted for speculative concerns. They ordered continued operations. His voice grew hollow. 3 days later, the main facility collapsed. 43 people died. People I knew. People who trusted the systems I was responsible for maintaining. Aria listened intently, her expression solemn. The star was a gift from a girl named Maya, daughter of one of the miners. She made it in the colony school program. Gave it to me because I'd helped design a safe playground for the children. His fingers tightened around the arms of his chair. She died in the collapse, along with her parents. "Not your fault," Aria said softly, her limited vocabulary nevertheless conveying her meaning clearly. Ethan smiled bitterly. "I tell myself that. Sometimes I almost believe it. I could have done more. Sabotaged the equipment, staged an emergency, something to force evacuation. Instead, I followed protocol, filed my reports, and trusted the system to work." He shook his head. "The corporation cleared themselves of wrongdoing, of course, classified it as an unforeseen natural disaster, paid settlements to the families of those who had proper contracts. The rest were forgotten." "Why stay?" Aria asked, gesturing to the cabin, the planet. "Penance, I suppose," Ethan admitted. "Or maybe just cowardice. Easier to hide here than face a universe where profit margins outweigh lives." He looked up at her. "Until you arrived and reminded me there are things worth fighting for." Aria considered this, then stood and moved to the nightstand. With gentle fingers, she picked up the cracked star. "Fix," she said, looking at Ethan questioningly. "Together?" The simple offer struck Ethan deeply. The star had remained broken for years, a physical manifestation of his guilt and grief. The thought of repairing it had never occurred to him, perhaps because he felt he didn't deserve the closure it might bring. "I don't know if it can be fixed," he said honestly. Aria smiled, a rare, beautiful expression that transformed her face. "Try," she insisted, already examining the fractured edges of the wooden ornament. "Always try." The next day, they began the delicate work of repairing the star alongside their continued restoration of the cabin. Aria proved to have a natural talent for detailed craftsmanship, her slender fingers manipulating tiny components with precision. She approached the task with reverence, understanding its significance to Ethan without needing it explained further. As the days passed, the cabin gradually returned to functionality. The shields were restored, the damage repaired, new defenses installed. The star, too, began to take shape again, not perfectly as it had been, but whole in a new way, with fine seams where the breaks had been, stronger for having been rebuilt with care. Aria's personality emerged more fully as her confidence grew and her language skills improved. She had a quick mind, absorbing information eagerly, and an unexpected streak of gentle humor that sometimes caught Ethan off guard. She was also remarkably resilient. The nightmares continued, but she faced each day with determined optimism that Ethan found himself envying. One morning, as they shared breakfast, Iria made an announcement that surprised him. "I want new name," she said. When Ethan looked confused, she elaborated. "Iria is before name, slave name." She touched the brand at the base of her neck, now fading but still visible. "Want new name for new life." Ethan nodded slowly. "That makes sense. Do you have one in mind?" She smiled, a hint of mystery in her expression. "Learning words, finding right one." She tapped her chest. "We'll know when right." As the weeks passed, their lives fell into a comfortable rhythm. Ethan taught Iria everything he knew about survival on Epsilon 7, how to read weather patterns, maintain equipment, preserve food, navigate the barren landscape. In turn, she brought a presence to his life that he hadn't realized he'd been missing: conversation, companionship, even occasional laughter. The question of what would happen long-term remained unaddressed. Iria's declaration under the Autonomy Protocol protected her legally, but Epsilon 7 was hardly an ideal place for her to build a new life. The nearest functioning settlement was hundreds of kilometers away, and even there, an alien alone would face significant challenges. Ethan found himself increasingly troubled by this unspoken dilemma. The right thing would be to help her reach a proper Federation outpost where she could receive official documentation, proper medical care, and assistance finding others of her kind. But the thought of returning to his solitude after these weeks of shared existence filled him with a dread he was reluctant to examine. Spring arrived on Epsilon 7, a relative term for a planet locked in perpetual winter, but a noticeable shift nonetheless. The brutal storms became less frequent. The twilight brightened to almost daylight for several hours each cycle, and the temperature occasionally rose above freezing. With the improved weather came a new project. Iria, who had been experimenting with the cabin's limited plant cultivation system, asked Ethan if they could attempt to grow something outside. "Outside?" he repeated, skeptical. "Nothing grows in this soil. The mining operations leached most of the nutrients decades ago." But Iria was persistent. During her captivity, she explained in her improving but still simple Federation standard, she had tended plants for her captors, part of her duties as living property. Laarians had a natural affinity for growing things, a connection to botanical life that transcended normal cultivation techniques. "I can help soil," she insisted. "Laarian way?" Intrigued, despite his doubts, Ethan helped her prepare a small area near the southern wall of the cabin, where it would receive the most light and be somewhat sheltered from the wind. They mixed the sterile native soil with composted material from the cabin's waste reclamation system. Not ideal, but better than nothing. Iria knelt beside the prepared plot, closed her eyes, and placed her palms flat on the ground. For several minutes, she remained motionless, her breathing deep and rhythmic. Ethan watched in fascination as a subtle change came over the soil beneath her hands, a barely perceptible shift in color, texture, vitality. When she opened her eyes, she smiled up at him. "Ready now," she said. "Need seed." From the cabin's emergency supplies, Ethan produced a small packet of seeds, part of the standard survival kit, intended for sustainable food production if resupply became impossible. They had never seemed a viable option in Epsilon 7's harsh environment, but Iria examined them with approval. Together, they planted a single seed in the center of the prepared soil. Iria covered it carefully, then performed another of her mysterious Laarian rituals, singing softly in her native language as she sprinkled water over the planting. "Now we wait," she said, looking pleased with their work. Ethan expected nothing to come of this experiment, but he kept his skepticism to himself. If it gave Iria joy to try, that was enough. To his amazement, within days, a tiny green shoot appeared, a practical impossibility given Epsilon 7's climate and soil conditions. The plant grew with surprising vigor, developing sturdy leaves that seemed resistant to the cold. Iria tended it daily, speaking to it in her language, touching its leaves with gentle fingers. "What is it?" Ethan asked one day as they observed the plant's progress. "Life," Iria replied simply. Then, seeing his confusion, she elaborated. "Symbol. New beginning." The plant became a focal point for both of them, a tangible representation of possibility in a place defined by limitations. Ethan found himself checking on it first thing each morning, taking an irrational pride in each new leaf, each centimeter of growth. As the plant thrived, so too did Iria. Her confidence expanded, her language skills sharpened, and she began to speak more of the future. Not just day-to-day survival, but longer-term aspirations. She wanted to learn to read and write Federation standard properly. She wanted to understand the technical systems that kept the cabin functioning. She wanted, someday, to find others of her kind and learn if any of her family had survived. Ethan listened to these dreams with mixed emotions. He wanted these things for her. She deserved them, and more, after all, she had endured. But each aspiration pointed toward an inevitable departure from the cabin, from Epsilon 7th, from him. The matter came to a head unexpectedly. During a routine check of the communications array, Ethan detected an automated signal from a Federation patrol vessel passing through the system. It wasn't unusual. Such patrols occurred every few months, primarily monitoring for illegal mining operations or other restricted activities. Normally, Ethan kept the cabin systems in passive mode, avoiding detection. This time, however, he hesitated. The patrol vessel represented an opportunity for Iria, a direct connection to Federation authorities who could validate her declaration, provide her with official documentation, and transport her to a proper settlement with resources for displaced persons. It was the right thing to do. He knew that. And yet, his finger hovered over the response key, unwilling to initiate contact. Iria found him like that, staring at the console, his expression troubled. "What wrong?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. Ethan gestured to the display. "Federation patrol. They could help you. Take you somewhere better than this." The words felt like stones in his throat. Iria studied the display. Then Ethan's face. Understanding dawned in her eyes, not just of the opportunity, but of his reluctance. "You want me go?" she asked quietly. "No," Ethan admitted, the truth escaping before he could contain it. "But you should have more than this. A real chance at a new life. Not just survival in exile with a broken-down engineer." Iria was silent for a long moment, her gaze steady on his face. Then she reached out and deliberately pressed the key to close the communication channel without responding to the patrol. "My choice," she said firmly. "I stay." "Iria," Ethan began. "You don't understand. There's nothing for you here. The conditions are brutal, supplies are limited, and I'm not." He struggled to articulate the inadequacy he felt, the certainty that she deserved better than he could provide. "I understand choice," she interrupted, an unusual steel in her voice. "First, real choice. My choice." She placed her hand over his on the console. "I choose here, for now." Her expression softened. "Future has many paths. Today, I choose this one." Ethan looked into her eyes, those alien violet eyes that had once been filled with terror and were now alight with determination, and found he had no argument that could stand against her agency. After all, she had endured. Who was he to dictate what was best for her? "All right," he said finally, "for now." That evening, as a rare, clear sky allowed the stars to shine through Epsilon 7's thin atmosphere. They sat outside the cabin, bundled against the cold, observing the plant that continued its improbable growth in the hostile soil. "I found name," Aria said suddenly, breaking a comfortable silence. "New name." Ethan turned to her, curious. "What is it?" "Niara," she replied, the syllables flowing melodically in her voice. "In my language means quiet light, light that survives darkness, light that endures." "Niara," Ethan repeated, testing the sound. It suited her. This being who had emerged from unimaginable darkness, yet somehow preserved an inner light. "It's a good name." She smiled, pleased by his approval. "I am Niara now. New life, new name." As if in response to this declaration, a gust of wind swept down from the mountains, rattling the cabin walls and threatening their small plant. Without hesitation, both Ethan and Niara moved to protect it, his body blocking the wind while she stabilized the soil around its base. The moment passed. The wind subsided, and the plant remained upright, bent slightly but unbroken. Niara stroked its leaves gently, murmuring encouragement in her native tongue. Ethan watched her, a realization slowly dawning. In trying to save Niara, he had inadvertently saved himself as well. The walls he had built around his heart, the isolation he had accepted as penance, they had begun to crumble the moment he carried her through the storm into his cabin. Her presence had reminded him of what it meant to care, to connect, to find purpose beyond mere survival. "We should reinforce the north wall tomorrow," he said as they headed back inside, the temperature dropping rapidly as the brief, clear spell ended. "The last storm caused some structural weakening I haven't fully addressed." "I help," Niara replied confidently. "Learning fast." "Yes, you are," Ethan agreed, surprised to find himself smiling, an expression that was becoming less foreign to his face with each passing day. Inside, the cabin welcomed them with warmth and light, no longer just Ethan's refuge from a hostile world, but a shared space, a home of sorts. The repaired wooden star now sat on a shelf near the fire, its mended fractures visible but no longer jagged, a testament to patience and care. That night, as a new storm gathered strength outside, Ethan found himself unable to sleep. The events of the day, the choice to let the Federation patrol pass without contact, Niara's new name, the shared moment protecting their unlikely plant, had stirred emotions he had long suppressed. He rose quietly and moved to the window, watching ice crystals form intricate patterns on the glass. Behind him, Niara slept peacefully on the cot that had become hers, no longer plagued by the violent nightmares of her early days in the cabin. The future remained uncertain. The harsh reality of Epsilon 7 hadn't changed. Limited resources, brutal conditions, isolation from the wider universe. Sooner or later, difficult decisions would need to be made. But for now, in this moment, there was a sense of rightness that Ethan hadn't felt in years. When the spring thaw began in earnest, it brought new challenges. The permafrost that had kept the cabin's foundation stable through the winter began to shift, causing ominous creaks and subtle tilting in the structure. What had been a minor concern in previous years now required immediate attention. The eastern wall, already weakened by the traffickers' assault, showed signs of potential collapse. Ethan and Niara worked tirelessly to stabilize the cabin. They reinforced support beams, redistributed weight-bearing loads, and constructed external buttresses from salvaged materials. It was exhausting, often dangerous work, made more difficult by dwindling supplies and equipment that had seen better days. During one particularly precarious repair session, a support beam slipped suddenly, nearly crushing Ethan beneath its weight. Niara moved with surprising speed, using a metal rod as a lever to lift the beam just enough for him to scramble to safety. They sat afterward in stunned silence, covered in dust, the reality of how close they had come to disaster hanging between them. "Thank you," Ethan said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Quick thinking." Niara nodded, her own expression solemn. "Partners," she said simply. "Protect each other." That word, partners, lingered in Ethan's mind long after the immediate crisis had passed. It described their relationship more accurately than any other term. Not quite family, not merely friends or companions, but partners navigating survival together, each contributing their unique strengths to their shared existence. As the cabin gradually stabilized, their attention returned to the plant outside, now grown to knee-height and producing small, star-shaped leaves that seemed to glow faintly in the dim epsilon light. Niara tended it with devotion, and Ethan found himself increasingly fascinated by its improbable flourishing in such hostile conditions. "What will it become?" he asked one day, as they observed its progress. Niara smiled mysteriously. "Wait and see. Special." The days lengthened marginally as Epsilon 7 continued its sluggish orbit. With the relative improvement in weather came the possibility of exploring beyond the immediate vicinity of the cabin, something Niara had never done since her arrival during the winter storm. Ethan was reluctant at first, concerned about potential dangers. But Niara's curiosity was insatiable. She wanted to understand the planet that had become her temporary home, to see the landscape that surrounded their small sanctuary. They began with short excursions, heavily prepared for sudden weather changes, and never venturing beyond sight of the cabin. Niara approached each expedition with wonder, examining ice formations, collecting unusual mineral samples, observing the subtle variations in the seemingly monotonous terrain. Through her eyes, Ethan began to see beauty in a landscape he had long regarded as merely hostile. During one such exploration, they discovered the remains of Niara's escape pod, half buried in a snowdrift several kilometers from the cabin. The small craft was badly damaged, its systems beyond repair. But Niara approached it with reverence, touching the scorched hull, peering inside at the cramped space that had carried her to freedom. "Thought I'd die here," she said quietly, running her fingers along the crumpled metal. "Last hope." Ethan stood beside her, trying to imagine her desperation, fleeing captivity in a stolen escape pod, crash landing on an unknown frozen world, stumbling through killing cold with nothing but determination, keeping her alive until she reached his cabin. "You're stronger than you know," he said, the inadequacy of words striking him even as he spoke. Niara looked up at him, her violet eyes reflecting the pale epsilon light. "Strong together," she corrected. "Alone. I die. You save. Now we save each other." They salvaged what they could from the pod. Some specialized tools. A data crystal containing Larian cultural information. A small metal container inscribed with symbols Niara identified as a family blessing. Each item represented a piece of her heritage, tangible connections to who she had been before captivity tried to erase her identity. Back at the cabin, Niara created a small alcove for these treasures, arranging them carefully alongside the repaired wooden star, a melding of her past with their shared present. Ethan watched her work, struck by the simple grace with which she integrated these fragments of memory into their living space. That night, as they shared a meal enhanced by Niara's increasingly sophisticated adjustments to their standard rations, Ethan found himself speaking of possibilities he had not considered in years. "The next supply drone is scheduled in 2 months," he said, keeping his tone casual, though the topic was anything but. "We could modify it to carry a message back to the settlement. Let them know there are 2 of us here now. Request additional resources." Niara looked up from her food, surprise evident in her expression. Ethan had maintained strict isolation since before her arrival, never communicating with the distant settlement except for automated acknowledgments of supply deliveries. "You want contact?" she asked carefully. Ethan considered the question. Not exactly. But if you're staying, he paused, suddenly uncertain. If that's still what you want, then we need to think longer term. The cabin supplies were calculated for one person. The system's designed for minimal usage. We're managing now, but not sustainable. Nyara finished for him, demonstrating her growing command of Federation standard. Need more resources for 2 people. Yes, Ethan agreed, relieved by her understanding. And there are things you should have access to. Proper medical care, educational materials, communication options, a chance to contact others of your kind. Perhaps. Nyara was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Would mean others know I hear, she said finally. Could be dangerous. The concern was valid. While her declaration under the Autonomy Protocol offered legal protection, the reality of frontier worlds was often far removed from Federation law. The Vermilion chain or other trafficking operations might still consider her worth retrieving, particularly if they learned she was isolated with minimal defenses. We'd be careful, Ethan assured her. Use secure channels, verified contacts only. The settlement administrator is a good person. She helped me set up here after I left the colony. She would understand the situation. Nyara studied his face, her perceptive gaze seeming to read more than his words. This important to you, she observed. Not just practical concern. Ethan hadn't expected such insight, though perhaps he should have. Nyara had proven remarkably adept at reading emotional nuances, despite the cultural and species differences between them. I want you to have choices, he admitted. Real ones. Not just the choice between staying here or facing the wilderness alone. If you're going to stay, it should be because this is truly what you want, not because there are no other options. Nyara's expression softened. Already have more choices than before, she said gently. Every day, choose what to do, what to learn, how to live. This is... She searched for the right word. Precious. She reached across the table, a gesture she had rarely initiated before, and placed her hand over his. We send message, she decided. Careful message. Take next step together. The simple touch, the quiet confidence in her voice. They affected Ethan more deeply than he was prepared for. This being, who had every reason to retreat from connection, to guard herself against further harm, instead, continued to move forward with remarkable courage. Together, he agreed, his voice unexpectedly hoarse. The following weeks were filled with preparations. They drafted and redrafted the message to the settlement, carefully balanced between providing necessary information and protecting Nyara's privacy. They reinforced the cabin's defenses, adding new security measures designed to prevent electronic tracking or unauthorized access. And they continued their daily work of survival, maintaining systems, conserving resources, tending their improbable plant that now reached Nyara's waist and had begun to develop what appeared to be buds on its uppermost branches. Throughout these preparations, something subtle shifted between them. The easy camaraderie of shared tasks deepened into something more complex, a connection neither of them named, but both felt growing stronger with each passing day. It manifested in small ways, lingering glances, casual touches that became less casual, conversations that stretched late into the night. Nyara began sharing more of her culture, Larian songs that filled the cabin with haunting melodies. Stories of her childhood before captivity had interrupted her life. Philosophical concepts unique to her species' worldview. In turn, Ethan gradually opened up about his past beyond the tragedy of the mining colony. His training as an engineer, his early adventures on various worlds, the family he had left behind on Earth. The day the supply drone was scheduled to arrive, they stood together outside the cabin, watching the sky with mixed emotions. The drone would bring much-needed supplies, but it would also carry their message back to the settlement. the first step toward a future neither of them could fully predict. "Nervous?" Ethan asked, noticing Niara's unusual stillness. She nodded, her breath visible in the cold air. "Change coming. Good change. Maybe. But still." "I know," Ethan said softly. "Change is always uncertain." Their plant, now nearly as tall as Niara herself, swayed gently in the breeze. To their amazement, one of its buds had begun to open that morning, revealing a bloom unlike anything native to Epsilon 7th. Deep, violet petals with luminescent edges that pulsed faintly, even in daylight. "First flower," Niara said, her voice filled with wonder. Good timing. Good omen. Ethan wasn't generally superstitious, but he found himself hoping she was right. They had overcome so much already. The brutal environment, the traffickers' assault, the spring thaw that had nearly collapsed their shelter. Perhaps they had earned a stroke of good fortune. The drone appeared on the horizon, a dark speck growing larger against the pale sky. As it approached, they moved back to a safe distance, allowing its automated systems to identify the landing zone and begin descent. The sleek metal container settled gently on the designated pad, its engines powering down with a diminishing whine. Ethan approached cautiously, entering the access code that would release the supplies. The drone's compartment opened, revealing the standard provisions: food concentrates, medical supplies, replacement parts for essential systems, but also something unexpected: a small package marked with Ethan's name in unfamiliar handwriting. He brought the package back to where Niara waited, curiosity evident on both their faces. Inside, they found a datapad containing a personal message from the settlement administrator, Lydia Torres. "Ethan," the message began, "your supply requests have been consistent for years. Seeing these changes raised flags. Are you all right? Is someone there with you? If you need extraction or assistance, use Emergency Protocol 7. If this is a positive development, I'm glad. Either way, I've included some items that might be useful for 2 people rather than 1. Be well. Torres." Beneath the datapad lay items that brought unexpected emotion to Ethan's throat. Books on language instruction, medical supplies specifically designed for non-human physiologies, seed packets for plants that could grow in harsh conditions, and a small communications unit capable of connecting to the Federation network for educational and entertainment purposes only. No outgoing signal capacity that could be traced. "She understood," Ethan said softly, amazed by the administrator's perception and discretion. "Without us even sending our message." Niara examined the items with wonder, her fingers tracing the covers of the language instruction books, her eyes wide at the specialized medical supplies. "Kind person," she murmured. "Sees need. Helps without asking why." "Yes," Ethan agreed. "Lydia was always like that. She—" He hesitated, then continued. "She helped me disappear after the mining disaster. Understood I couldn't stay. Couldn't face what happened. Never asked questions. Just made arrangements." They loaded their supplies into the cabin, then prepared the drone for its return journey. Their carefully crafted message seemed almost redundant now, but they attached it nonetheless. A formal acknowledgement of Niara's presence, a cautious request for continued discretion, and thanks for the unexpected additional supplies. As the drone lifted off, carrying their message back to the distant settlement, Ethan and Niara stood side by side, watching until it disappeared from view. The flower on their plant had fully opened now, its luminescent edges pulsing more brightly as darkness began to fall. "Beautiful," Ethan said, not entirely sure if he meant the flower or the moment itself. This unexpected peace in a life that had known too little of it. Niara leaned slightly against his side, her warmth a counterpoint to the ever-present chill of Epsilon 7th. "Worth surviving for," she agreed. "Worth living for." That night, as they arranged their new supplies and examined the educational materials Torres had sent, A comfortable intimacy enveloped the cabin. The repaired wooden star seemed to glow in the firelight, its mended fractures now part of its character rather than flaws to be hidden. Their plant's flower was visible through the window, a point of violet light in the darkness outside. "Ethan," Nyara said as they prepared for sleep, her voice unusually hesitant. "Need to ask something." He turned to her, noting the seriousness in her expression. "Of course. Anything." She took a deep breath, gathering courage. "When found me, I had nothing. No home, no clothes, no hope." Her improving language skills allowed her to express complex thoughts now, though still with charming idiosyncrasies. "You gave all these things, but never asked for. After. What comes after?" Ethan frowned slightly, not following her meaning. "After? When I strong enough, well enough. When storm ends, when danger passes." Her violet eyes held his steadily. "Never asked if I stay or go. Never made conditions." Understanding dawned. In her experience, every act of apparent kindness had come with expectations, with cost to be paid. Even in her time at the cabin, she had been waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Ethan to reveal what he wanted in return for his protection. "There are no conditions," he said softly. "No debt to repay. What I did, what we've done for each other. That's not how it works. Not with people who—" He searched for the right words. "Who care about each other." Nyara stepped closer, her expression intent. "And you care? About me?" The directness of the question caught Ethan off guard. He had lived so long in isolation, built so many walls around his emotions, that articulating what he felt seemed almost impossible. And yet, facing Nyara's courage, he couldn't offer anything less than honesty. "Yes," he said simply, "more than I thought possible again." Something in her posture relaxed, a tension releasing that he hadn't fully recognized until it was gone. "Good," she said, "because I care too. About you. About us. About—" She gestured around the cabin. "This life we build." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then, Nyara reached up and gently touched his face, a gesture of such tenderness that Ethan felt something within him break and reform, the final wall around his heart crumbling at her touch. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything. For seeing me as person when others saw property. For teaching me to trust again. For making space in your life when you wanted to be alone." Ethan covered her hand with his own, holding it against his cheek. "You saved me too," he admitted. "I was just existing here, not living, punishing myself for failures I couldn't undo. You reminded me there's more to life than just surviving."